What should we spend on a wedding? What about a really, really big wedding? Do all of us need to have that? Or can we do a wedding on a budget? Can you cut corners? If you're trying to save for a home, can you invest in a home loan and invest in a wedding? Or do you have to ditch the wedding and go for the home? And what about wedding gifts? So Pete, how much should we spend on a wedding?
Probably less than they want to, would be my thoughts. I think you've got to spend what you're comfortable with and something that doesn't stretch you and the people contributing to it too much. One thing I have noticed with a couple of clients and friends that have got married is don't borrow for the wedding if you don't need to, if you have to take out a loan for your wedding.
As you would expect on Money, Faith and Finance, we didn't go prescriptive on the question of how much should you spend on a wedding. Of course, we're not going to
Spend less. I'm an accountant. What do you expect me to say?
But we're never going to say what you should spend. However, this conversation was triggered by this great article that we saw in the Australian Financial Review recently that was talking about the cost of weddings, particularly in this cost of living time that we find ourselves in, and making the point that a lot of people seem to be, and they interviewed some people in the article, were doing things like cutting back on the wedding that they wanted or they dreamed of, or not even having the wedding, but instead shifting the money off into, and this article is particularly focused on home loans, putting it into a house deposit, for example. Have you encountered this?
I definitely have. And I think what's probably happened is it's become a bit of an either or. You know, do you either have a great marriage or a great wedding? Is it possible to have both? And I think the reality...
A great marriage and a great wedding, or a great house
well, you
and a great wedding?
You can have both. I had both. You had both. We're still here. But I think these days the cost of a wedding could be 20% of a house deposit. You know, if you picked the average sort of, house deposit size. So people are looking at it going, the amount I spent on a wedding is probably coming straight off my savings and probably straight off what I could put into a house.
The figure that you just raised is pretty much bang on. In New South Wales, the median cost of a wedding is about 50 grand. And that would cover about 20% of a standard 20% deposit in New South Wales. 50 grand. Park that thought. We would love to hear from you on the cost of weddings, how much you spent. Did you cut costs in some way?
You can be anonymous if you need to.
Did you go extravagant? That's exactly right. We're not necessarily going to out you on the podcast, but we would love to share what happened for you and the choices you made, particularly if you were offsetting this cost for that cost. Love to hear from you at hopepodcast.com.au. That is a massive chunk of change, not only when you're talking about a house deposit, but also the cost of a wedding, Pete. The median cost, 50 grand.
It is, and I've probably seen clients and friends spend less than it and more than it. And I think if you said to most people, is your wedding going to cost 50 grand, they would say no. But I think the problem is people get hung up on the price per head that might be at the reception venue. So people might hear a number like $100 or $200 a head and think, you know what, my reception only cost 20 grand. Or my reception only cost 25 grand. People might have only paid 20 grand at the reception, but they've also had cars, photographers, honeymoon, flowers, bridesmaids' dresses, all those extra things add up. So I don't think people really think of a true per head cost for all the people that are there. And I see weddings that are 30 easily become 40 to 50.
Yowza. Before we get a little bit further into some of this contrast between am I going to pay for a wedding, am I going to pay for a house? And there was one statement in this Australian Financial Review article that I really want to run by you, Pete, that says a lot about what are we investing in, a house, a marriage. Before we get onto that, talking about the cost of a wedding, and I know things have changed. I got married about 12 years ago. Things have changed in that time. But we spent about 12 grand on the wedding and the reception, which in Sydney seems to be, I don't know if that was average or maybe below average
for the time,
But the point of raising it is, and that didn't take into account the dress, the suit, the rings, or the honeymoon, like none of that. So it was mainly just the day, the events, and how we celebrated it. But Amy and I both decided that there were things that we knew we could cut out. So we didn't have a photographer, we didn't have cars. We had
chairs, just donate it, cut them out.
We cut back on a bridal party, as in we had people at our ceremony, but we didn't have people up the front and therefore paying for other suits and that kind of stuff. And even on the wedding night, we didn't go to a hotel suite. We were moving into a new place, so we went and stayed there. So where I'm heading to is, and are you finding this with some of your clients or those that you know, when it comes to weddings, are people making choices, or do they think they still have to go for this massive, elaborate wedding dream that can make you take out a home loan, a loan for it.
A loan that might seem like a home loan. I think it's generational. I think younger people I've noticed probably seem happier to do something that's a bit more what you and I would probably call informal. I think rustic would be the cool word. So I think you can save money. I've had clients that have, they've eloped in a sense, the old-fashioned word. They've gone off and sort of just done the wedding registry and left without necessarily having a big ceremony. Others have got married on a weekday, so Friday weddings would be cheaper. Others have done an afternoon tea as opposed to a sit-down dinner. So I think there's more options these days, and especially the younger generation are probably happier to have perhaps more of a party that's got less of the formal aspects that really ramp up the cost of a wedding, especially at a traditional venue.
Really want to get back to this article, some of the people that were interviewed here and some of their thoughts about, particularly around investing in a house, investing in a wedding. But very quickly, also should note that we totally know, I'm sure you do personally, I do personally, people who have got married and there's been pressure on them to have the wedding, to have however many relatives and friends.
Of family, cultural backgrounds.
Right. All of that feeds into it. So we know it's not as easy as saying you can pick and choose, but you can pick and choose, particularly if you're in a position where you're able to do that or you feel able to do that.
Or if you need to have the conversation with family, like if I've had some clients where they've said, I said, how much did your kid's wedding cost? And they said, we told the kids, here's X dollars that we're going to put towards it. And that way, at least it made the kids know, you know what, here's what mum and dad can contribute, and they could start setting their expectations accordingly rather than fall in love with a wedding theme or venue only to have your heart broken later. So there's nothing wrong with being upfront about what everybody can contribute to it.
Do you know what is super unromantic?
That conversation, yeah.
And all of this conversation about the cost of weddings. And it's like we're trying to ruin the fun and the love.
Well, we're not. I mean, it's just a choice, right? Like there's an opportunity cost to having a really big wedding.
Yeah.
You don't want to saddle yourself with a debt or take money out of your future pocket for something that's one day. The wedding day is just one day of your marriage. It's going to be the most expensive. It doesn't have to be the only day though, does it?
Yeah. Now, speaking of which, and you're right, it doesn't have to be unromantic to talk about the real cost of what your wedding is going to be, but the romance of a wedding day and then how that contrasts with what you're actually entering into, which is marriage, which is the main event.
Yeah.
So it's actually the gateway to the main event.
It's like the undercard. It's like the practice warm-up sort of. Yeah.
And in this article, there's this point that's made, a contrast between somebody buying a property and they're saying arguably that's a bigger commitment for them than the marriage.
It might be longer. Mortgages are 30 years. Will the marriage last 30 years? It's a big commitment.
I will steer clear of that and just go back to, but I was actually quite disheartened and found that very unromantic to hear that in the decisions being made around the cost of massive life events, in this case, a wedding and a house, that the commitment of owning a home, which you're right, could be 30 years, was somehow the bigger consideration. It seemingly on the surface of this comment, on the surface of that, the bigger consideration than not just the wedding, but then what the wedding represents, which is the marriage.
It's a good point. I mean, I guess people that are, in all seriousness, buying a house and making that commitment, there's probably some level of commitment to the relationship anyway. So whether or not they might be calling it a marriage, they might already be living together, they might already have, shared goals and dreams. It might be a case of buy now, wed later, I think was the way the article put it. So maybe they are committed, but they just can't see that there's time or budget for a wedding.
And in all these conversations that I hope people are having, I hope they're not just diving into, I hope they're not just diving into marriage. I hope they're not just diving into
I think your
wedding.
12 years and my 27 might tell us, take your time, people. Take your time, choose wisely.
But also, as you're weighing up all the costs and all the things that you can pick and choose through, as people are having those conversations, I actually do hope that they're not prioritizing or valuing these things evenly. And as much as it's important to have a home, for example, and it feels like in Australia it keeps getting increasingly important to have a home. But if a home becomes prioritized over marriage or over making sure of the person that you're committing with, my heart kind of breaks at that point. Like this is where faith and finance, we're talking about the soul of us and the practical outworkings of what we do with what we have come together.
Is it possible to have both, I guess? That's the...
Do you reckon?
I think you can. I think it's life is compromises, and if two things seem expensive and people need to secure their housing, maybe the marriage and the wedding will seem like the thing that has to go by the wayside. But I'm similar to you. I would like to think in a perfect world, I'd love to think my kids could have a nice wedding and have a great day and have all the people there that meant something to them, but then also one day go on to own a house if they wanted to do so. So you'd like to think people could do both, but it's possibly getting harder in our society to do that.
And we haven't even touched on yet other aspects of the wedding, such as those who are attending the wedding and what they're shelling out. Are you willing to say at this point on Money, Faith and Finance what it costs, what you should spend on a wedding? Are you willing to say what you should spend on a wedding gift?
Look, I am, because I think I always like to be generous, and probably the accountant in me says if I knew what it cost per head, I generally tend to think I'd like to cover my costs. So if you went to someone's wedding and it was $200 a head, I'd like to think, you know what, why aren't I putting in a couple $100 so that in a sense it was cost neutral. I was cost neutral to the wedding.
How long have you run that?
Probably for a while. We're relatively generous when we go to weddings. I tend to think people have had us here. I've been complimented that they felt I was important enough to be invited to the wedding. They might have invited me and my wife. So I tend to think, you know what, let's repay it and be generous back.
Let us know in the comments if you have done anything like what Pete just described, because Pete, all the words that you just used in those last couple of sentences, I have not considered. And I like to think of myself as a generous person, but I have never thought about being a wedding guest and being cost neutral for them.
I know, it's a bit dry, isn't it?
That is dry, but the sentiment behind it is
there's no gift registries these days. I've found these days, the last few weddings I've been to have sort of, they put a nice little poem and la-di-da-di-da, but the rhyme of the poem is, your presence is presence enough, but by the way, here's our bank account if you'd like to give us money. So generally, I tend to think people often have these things, especially if they're getting married a little bit older. They've got all the knickknacks that you would traditionally buy at a wedding, gift registry. So often money will actually help them, ironically, recoup the cost of the wedding, but also to go towards their future life.
Which could lend them towards having the wedding and also having the house deposit, for example.
Yep.
We'd love to hear from you on all of this. So in the YouTube comments, at the Facebook group, Money, Faith and Finance, hopepodcast.com.au. Get in touch with us. Pete, heading towards Show Me the Money on this, what do we take away?
I think the takeaway is weddings are great. We're not anti-weddings. It's just...
Did we sound anti-weddings?
I mean, we're married and we both have weddings. So therefore, we're not anti-weddings.
Oh, I love weddings.
It's not the only day. It's just the first day. So you need to think about it's got to be paid for. Yes, you want to enjoy it. But your family and friends, they're still going to love you and enjoy it, whether it's a lavish wedding or whether it's a small wedding. You need to do what you can afford, that you're comfortable with, that will represent your love for that person.
I reckon that while there are situations where it must be very difficult to pick and choose, we are living in an era where most of us can. So pick and choose what you put into the wedding so it does fit in with your budget. Don't take out a loan for it. And also, I reckon if you're trying to save for all sorts of other stuff and invest in other stuff, invest in your marriage first and invest in all the other stuff after that.
Oh, nice. I like it.
Thank you, Pete. I do.
Wait, are you a bigamist now? You're already married. You can't marry me too.
But let's not go down that rabbit hole. Instead, let's come back up and say thank you very much for being here in our What Should You Stump Up on a Wedding? Star rate, subscribe,
5.
share, and we'll see you next time on Money, Faith and Finance, where I'll be Ben McKecken from Hope Mornings, and you'll be none other than Pete Burrows
from Lower Russell and Farr. Accountants in Penrith. Individuals and small business tax returns.
You passed the test.